Welcome everybody to chapter 23, Monetary Policy, a Summing Up. In this chapter, we will learn that for the 2 decades before the 2008-2009 crisis, most central banks used a strategy for monetary policy called inflation targeting. This period is also labeled as the Great Moderation because of the fact that during this time period, more or less, we did not experience major trouble in monetary policy, and the whole situation was pretty stable in this time period. The textbook claims that the inflation targeting framework has 2 principles: keep inflation stable and low, and follow explicitly or implicitly an interest rate rule. I don't share the second opinion that inflation targeting has to be linked to an explicit or implicit interest rate rule. I think that these two concepts are different concepts, and we will get to know these differences within this chapter. But let's check what we have learned so far, what we should know already. In chapter 4, we talked about money demand and money supply and the determination of the interest rate. We learned that money demand depends on GDP. This is a transaction motive, and money demand also depends on the nominal interest rate, which is the opportunity cost of holding money argument. Money demand depends in a positive way on GDP. There is a positive sign in the equation, and money demand depends in a negative way on the interest rate. There is a negative sign in front of the interest rate variable. Money supply. Here it is the case that we have to distinguish the monetary base, which can be controlled completely by the central bank, and other monetary aggregates, so for example M3, which represents money supply. So we have to distinguish H and M. H is completely under control of the central bank, while money supply M is not. Please don't forget the role of the commercial banking sector in the money creation process. This is very important. In chapter 5, we talked about the short-run effects of monetary policy on output. The equilibrium condition in the money market was displayed by a horizontal LM curve. Perhaps LM, like L, which represents liquidity demand, and M, which represents money supply, is misleading. So maybe it's better to call this horizontal line an interest rate line, because the central bank is still using money supply as its instrument, and a fixed nominal interest rate is the target of the monetary policy. So maybe this horizontal line should be labeled interest rate line. Anyway, this is just a definition. We learned that an expansionary monetary policy increases GDP, and an expansionary monetary policy can especially be used to counter a negative good demand shock. Let's switch to chapter 6. In chapter 6, we introduced the distinction between the nominal interest rate and the real interest rate. Perhaps you remember, like this marshmallow video. There we introduced the nominal and the real interest rate. We also introduced the distinction between the borrowing rate and the policy rate. So the policy rate is the interest rate set by the central bank. But this is not the same interest rate companies can borrow at. So we were looking at how the borrowing rate increased during the crisis while the policy rate decreased. So in the financial crisis 2008-2009, the so-called interest rate spread, the difference between the borrowing rate and the policy rate increased tremendously. When it comes to the real and nominal interest rate, we should distinguish the two terms expected real interest rate and realized real interest rate, where we have to think about whether we use the realized inflation rate or the expected inflation rate. The so-called zero lower bound is related to the nominal interest rate. When the nominal interest rate is equal to 0 and the inflation rate is positive, pi is equal to 2%, then the real interest rate can become negative, a negative 2%. So the zero lower bound is related to the nominal interest rate, not the real interest rate. As I mentioned before, the difference between the policy rate and the borrowing rate is due to a risk premium. In chapter 9, we talked about the monetary policy in the medium run. And here, monetary policy should especially be used to counter shocks. So, when a negative demand shock occurs, then this would lead to deflation, and the central bank should lower the interest rate. In case that a positive demand shock occurs, this would lead to inflation, and the central bank should increase the interest rate. A negative supply shock, for example, the oil price increases, would lead to inflation, and the central bank should increase the interest rate. So when there is inflation in the economy, the central bank should increase the interest rate. The other way around, in case that there is a positive supply shock, for example, the oil price decreases, this will lead to deflation, and the central bank should lower the interest rate. In chapter 19 and chapter 20, we talked about monetary policy in the open economy. And this is especially important for Denmark because of the fact that Denmark is a small open economy. It has a fixed exchange rate system in place, and hence, in case that you prepare for the final exam, it should be the case that you look at these two chapters and especially have a look at the fixed exchange rate system. In chapter 21, we talked about the problems facing macroeconomic policy and monetary policy. So it is the case that we talked in a first subchapter about empirical problems, and there we learned that 10 different models forecast different effects of an interest rate cut on US GDP, and the conclusion was that monetary policy should act carefully. In the theoretical subchapter, we talked about the so-called time inconsistency problem. Like after the expectations are formed and your wage contracts are set, the central bank has an incentive to increase inflation and thereby increase the prices in order to surprise the wage setters. This will lower the real wage because of the fact that the nominal wages W are fixed for the next few years. The prices increase and hence the real wage decreases. Labor will be relatively cheap and therefore GDP will increase. This was a short flashback, so what we have learned so far. And now I will switch to subchapter 23.2, from money targeting to inflation targeting. In the first graph, you can see a line diagram, M1 growth and inflation, 10-year averages, 1970 to the crisis. We can see here the M1 growth rate and also the inflation rate for the US. And in the first step, I think it makes sense to clarify 10-year averages. What's that? The answer is given in the textbook. So the first observation in 1970, this is the average M1 growth and the average inflation rate during the time period 1961 to 1970. In the textbook, they conclude that there is no tight relationship between M1 growth and inflation, and the reason for this instabilities in the US money demand is the credit cards, which were introduced in this time period and which are heavily used in the US. The main conclusion is that money targeting does not work. At least it does not work in the US. Some critical remarks related to this graph. In the textbook, they talk about correlation, and therefore I think that a scatter diagram would be a better representation of this relationship compared to a line graph. So I think that a scatter diagram would be more informative. Furthermore, on the pages 483 to 448, you can read the following line of argumentation. The reason for stopping at the crisis is that when the economy hits the zero lower bound, like the US in 2008, increases in money supply no longer have an effect on the policy rate, and by implication, the central bank is no longer able to affect output and inflation. Therefore, we want to exclude the time period where the US was stuck at the zero lower bound. So this sentences, they stem from this part of the textbook, and I don't think that this is very convincing. So the textbook argues that this relationship does not hold in the time period 1970 to 2005. So I think that there is no change during the crisis period. Therefore, I think it would be interesting to also see the crisis, whether this relationship is more loose or even more loose than before. Furthermore, it is the case that it does not make sense to stop this graph because the M1 growth rate for me seems to be very important because the central bank engaged in quantitative easing, so the Federal Reserve used the instrument of increasing money supply in order to affect the real economy. The central bank tried to increase money supply to affect output and to affect inflation, and therefore the whole argument is a little bit skewed. So I don't think that this explanation is a good one. Furthermore, it is the case that this empirical evidence is only valid for the US. When it comes to Europe and the euro area, it is a case that we have to look at the ECB. And their money growth is important, or money growth at least was important. When you look at the monetary policy of the ECB, they always emphasize that they have a two-pillar system. One pillar is the economic analysis, where a lot of macroeconomic variables are examined. And then the monetary analysis is very important. So for a very long time period, it is the case that the ECB had a target with respect to the growth rate of M3. So for a long time period, like at least the first 10 years where the ECB was operating, the ECB was communicating a money growth target for M3, and they emphasized this value of 4.5%. I think that this target was never officially abolished, but the ECB just stopped talking about it. Recently, the monetary policy strategy of ECB is under revision, Maybe this will change in the next few years, but I think that for the ECB policy right now, money targeting is an important element of monetary policy strategy of the ECB. What are the alternatives to money targeting for the monetary policy strategy? There are two alternatives, inflation targeting and an interest rate rule, and I think that these two approaches are alternatives. Central banks can use inflation targeting without an explicit or implicit interest rate rule. Let's start with inflation targeting. Let's recall the Phillips curve relationship, which we get to know already. On the left-hand side, we have the inflation rate, the right-hand side, the expected inflation rate, and then in brackets, we have the unemployment gap. Let the inflation target be pi star, and we also assume that this inflation target is credible. So the central bank to some extent has gained reputation, and the central bank in the past was able to deliver this inflation target so that people expect inflation to be equal to the target. Then the Phillips curve relationship becomes equation 2. Inflation rate on the left-hand side is equal to the inflation target minus the unemployment gap. Here it is very important to see that in case that the central bank is able to hit the inflation target, then unemployment will be equal to its natural rate. So keeping inflation stable is a way of keeping unemployment at potential, and thereby also output is at potential. Stabilizing inflation implies stabilizing output. There is no conflict of interest between price stability and output stability. A focus on keeping stable inflation is the right approach to monetary policy, both in the short term and in the medium run. When it comes to inflation targeting, most central banks adjust the interest rate to return to the target inflation rate over time, rather than right away. We call this behavior flexible inflation targeting. So the central banks, they don't want to bring inflation to the target right away, but they will give the economy some time to digest and some time to prepare. We can see that in the following diagram. So we can see here in the black line, this is a federal funds target rate over time. And then from the mid-2004 to the mid-2006, the Federal Reserve increased the interest rate. And the central bank announced that it will increase the interest rate by 0.25% each 3 months. So the interest rate will increase by 0.25% each quarter. And this is an evidence of flexible inflation targeting. So the central banking is announcing its policy and is sticking to it and tries to adjust over time, not in the very short run. This is different in times of crisis. When there is a crisis, for example, here in the year 2008, then the central bank is reacting very fast and is cutting the interest rate in big steps and also in several steps over shorter time periods. So this flexible inflation targeting to adjust the interest rate over time is especially important in a phase where the central bank is increasing the interest rates. Let's switch to the second concept, the interest rate rule, which is called a Taylor rule. It's called a Taylor rule because the first person who suggested to look at an interest rate rule was John Taylor, published in 1991. He suggested the following rule for monetary policy. So on the left-hand side, we have the target interest rate. So this is the policy rate of the Federal Reserve. Then on the right-hand side, there is an interest rate target. The interest rate target is equal to the natural real rate of interest plus the target inflation rate. The other elements, A and B, are coefficients and they are chosen by the central bank. So A and B represent the weights attached to the inflation gap and the unemployment gap. A short remark here: in his original article published in 1991, Taylor worked with the output gap instead of the unemployment gap. So in equation 3, you can see here the unemployment gap, but in the original article, there was the output gap. Let's proceed with this version of the Taylor rule and come up with a numerical example which can be found frequently in the literature. So we are looking at a paper published by Netgeo in the year 2011. The target interest rate is at the level of 4%. This is based on the observation that the natural rate of interest, like the natural real interest rate, was observed to be at 2% in the past. So some economists, they computed an average of the real interest rate in the past. It was equal to 2%, and hence it was assumed that the natural real interest rate is equal to 2%. The inflation target, pi star, is assumed to be equal to 2%. Then the two parameters are chosen in the following way. A is equal to 1.5. It is very important that A is larger than 1. It is called the Taylor principle, and you can read about it in the book. Then the weight with respect to B is equal to 1, so that we find the following Taylor rule in the literature. The policy rate, the federal funds rate, is equal to 4% plus 1.5 times the inflation gap minus 1 times the unemployment gap. Let's come up with a numerical example. Let's assume that the inflation gap is equal to 0 and the unemployment gap is equal to 0. In case that the inflation gap is equal to 0 and the unemployment gap is equal to 0, then the central bank should set the policy rate to the target. So the federal funds rate should be equal to the target and equal to 4%. Of course, when the inflation gap is 0, this implies that the realized inflation rate is at the target, and also the realized unemployment rate is equal to the natural rate of unemployment. In case that the inflation rate would increase, in case that pi increases, the central bank should increase the policy rate. In case that the inflation increases by 1 percentage point, it should be the case that the central bank should increase the policy rate by 1.5 percentage points. Only this secures that the real interest rate also increases. In case that the unemployment rate increases, the central bank should decrease the policy rate. So in case that there is cyclical unemployment increases, then it should be the case that the central bank decreases the policy rate. This is a short introduction to inflation targeting and to an interest rate rule. So I would like to make a break here. digest, check what you have learned so far, and I'll come back with a second video where I explain the next 3 chapters. Thank you very much for watching this video. Have a nice day. Bye bye.